So the new Arctic Monkeys album has been out for almost a month, and in true Arctic Monkeys fashion, what we got in terms of sound, style and substance was unexpected, to say the least. Yet again, the band continued to challenge expectations and push the boundaries as to what defines the Arctic Monkeys. And there really does seem to be no limit on what the band are or can be these days. But by not sticking to the rock-inspired route that was mapped out for them as a result of their earlier work, are the Monkeys getting themselves lost on their latest detour with the car? Or are they just simply taking the scenic route with that final destination in mind? In this video, I'm going to explain to you why I think this is the Arctic Monkeys' most confusing album to date. This is my full in-depth review of Arctic Monkeys' 7th studio album, The Car. Fasten your seatbelts, guys, this is one hell of a ride. Quick reminder to those of you that are new to the channel or have seen my previous videos, I'm covering absolutely everything Arctic Monkeys this month and beyond. So if you haven't subscribed already, please do, it helps the channel out. So I've had the album on repeat for about 3 weeks now. And as the band intended, I've been listening to the album in order, track by track, from start to finish. And boy does it take you on a sonic journey. Not only is it the most varied Arctic Monkeys album to date in terms of sound and instrumentation, but for me it's probably Arctic Monkeys' most well thought out album to date, sounding pretty cohesive from start to finish. And that's despite the car visiting several sonic destinations on its journey through the album. From the lounge jazz type sounds on Mirrorball, to the nostalgic Motown type vibes on I Ain't Quite Where I Think I Am, to the 70s Beatlesque rock band inspired Body Paint, to the spaghetti western sounding title track of the album, The Car. It really is a journey through cinema, but at the same time it's just a masterclass in musicianship from the band. The album is rich, full to the brim of interesting and unconventional chord patterns, clever and carefully selected instrumentation that fits each part like a glove. The band for me are simply one of very few in the mainstream that seem to continue to challenge themselves sonically and musically with every album. All 4 members of the band seem to develop and improve one way or another musically whenever they set out to make a new record. And with that, there are 3 key highlights of this album that really stood out to me. The first kind of major highlight for me that made me kind of reminisce about Humbug a little bit was that it's a grower. The more you listen, the more rewarding the songs get as far as I'm concerned. And it turns out the majority of you agree with me. And I think this is testament to how layered the album is in terms of production, but also how interesting the chord and melody patterns are on this record. You could honestly take any one of the 10 songs on the album and learn the piano chords or the guitar tabs or whatever, and you'll soon realise that every single song contains either a minor or major 7th chord, 9th chords or diminished chords. If the band were dipping their toe into jazz during Tranquility Base, well, they're kind of diving in head first here on this record. For me, it's a well-crafted, intricate album for the more careful and intentional listener. The album also contains some of the best songs the band have ever written, as far as I'm concerned. Song highlights for me include Mirrorball, Body Paint, of course, and Big Ideas. Although my favourites do seem to change week upon week, there's so much to dig into on this record that it's hard for me, to be honest, to choose a favourite. They just keep changing all the time. But what isn't up for discussion in my opinion is that Mirrorball and Body Paint are 2 of the best songs the band have ever written. And again, to those of you that aren't really feeling these songs yet, go listen to the live versions of these tunes. They just bring a completely different energy altogether when they're played live. And you do start to honestly realise just how good these songs are when you watch the live versions. The recorded versions for me are just a little bit lackluster in a way. More on that in a second, because there is a lot to discuss there. The final kind of key highlight for me here is that the album is just a production masterclass from start to finish. On every single song on this record, the way in which the layers of instrumentation and each of the parts just seem to jigsaw together perfectly is just astounding to me. Like, there is a shit ton going on in every song, let's be clear about that. Way more than the standard 4 parts you'd hear from a 4-piece rock band. And you can just tell that the Pro Tools sessions for each of these tunes was probably pretty huge and pretty complex, with each song being built up of several multi-tracks, put it that way. But the sonic landscape to me in all of these songs doesn't sound like that. Every instrument has been carefully selected and carefully placed in the mix. Just really well executed, and for me, the producer James Ford has knocked it out the park on this one production wise. Mixing wise though, I'm not 100% sure, and let me dig into this because this is probably my biggest gripe of the album. So for me, where the album falls down a little bit is that it kind of lacks energy throughout the whole thing. And let me be clear about this, I don't mean it's because there are slower tempo songs on the album. And I also don't mean that it's because Alex sings a bit softer on this one also. I mean it from a mixing perspective, so for example how the vocals have actually been processed. See, what a lot of people don't realise is that Arctic Monkeys' fifth album and their most popular commercial album to date, AM, the one we all love, that was actually mixed by Chad Blake. Now, Chad Blake is a world-renowned mix engineer, and he's responsible for mixing some of the biggest rock albums ever. His approach to mixing is very bombastic and larger than life, and he's also known in the industry as a little bit of a mad scientist when it comes to mixing. Now, I'm not saying that AM sounds really good just because of Chad Blake, but it's clear that he's had a big impact on the way that the final record sounded. The band actually specifically requested that Chad mix AM, specifically because his style just suited the album through and through. He tends to distort pretty much everything, and that just adds so much energy to the recordings after the fact. He uses a Sans amp plugin on pretty much everything. He mixes in hard-hitting hip-hop style drum samples with the live drums that are recorded in pretty much every rock session. Black Keys, El Camino, just one example. AM, obviously another. He's just a master at taking a fairly lackluster recording and making it sound massive. Now, this record was mixed by James Ford, the producer. Now, James is famous for his production with the Monkees, but not so much the mixing. And I can't help but feel a little bit let down by the approach to the mixing of Alex's vocals on this one. They just sound a bit lifeless to me on some of these songs. And they also lack that mid-range punchiness that you tend to hear on rock records or records that the Monkees have done in the past, let's just say. Take the title track, The Car, for example. For me, the vocals on this track on the recorded version just may well not be there, you know? It's kind of not really the focal point of the mix in any way, and I find them to be a distraction rather than the thing that I want to listen to in the song. But, and here's the big but, compare that to the live version the Monkees did just this weekend on Jules Holland. The song in that performance just comes alive. It just has so much energy, and you really start to appreciate Alex's vocals on the song in that live version. Now compare that to the studio version, which is just a little bit lackluster and boring and a little bit lifeless, in my opinion at least. And, you know, some subtle saturation or distortion or just a bit of delay or something like that might have been just what the vocal needed in that recorded version to bring it to life a little bit more. Another example, let's take Body Paint. When the guitars and the drums kick in for that big final rock anthemic refrain, the drums are just a bit lifeless on the recorded version. I mean, sure, it's a cool aesthetic for the record, that sort of tinny, slightly 70s Ringo-esque drum sound, but they're just lifeless and they lack energy and they don't do the song justice at all, in my opinion. Now, compare that again to the live version. Again, Jimmy Kimmel, Jonathan Ross, Jules Holland, take your pick. The song once again just comes alive and has so much energy, especially in that final refrain. There is just so much energy in that live performance, and you start to realise what that recorded studio version could have been. That's my point. Now, that's one reason why I think the album could be lacking energy, but there is another reason. And for me, it actually relates to how the album was made this time around. I mean, from the interviews that we've heard online, we know that the making of this album wasn't exactly seamless for the band. It was done in sections, intermittently during COVID, and it was a bit fragmented. Now, as a music maker myself, I really do understand the importance of capturing that initial energy or magic that happens when you first come up with an idea or a song or a riff or something like that. And it's often a reason why several bands actually use the parts that they recorded in the demo versions of songs in the final mix. I mean, the making of The Pretender by the Foo Fighters is a great example of that happening. When Dave Grohl laid down those initial demo guitars, the energy of that performance just couldn't be recaptured in the same way, and so the band just ended up using those demo guitars on the final mix. It kind of sounds counterintuitive, but with music, sometimes the longer you deliberate and take over a song, the worse the outcome can be, and it's very easily overworked. And for me, this album just doesn't encompass the energy of the band in the same way that previous albums have done. And the album sounds a little bit too perfect for me, a little bit too sterile, if that's the right word. If I was to use an analogy for this, if the band's first record, Whatever People Say I Am, That's What I'm Not, is an old, dusty, single-car garage, then this latest album is a hospital ward. I know which one has more charm. It's just a little bit too sterile, a little bit too perfect, and lacking in those small imperfections that, well, make music sound human. I feel as though this can be partly understood because, you know, as musicians, as you learn your craft and hone your craft over several years and you become more accomplished in the studio, more accomplished instrumentalists like the band have become, you kind of raise your own bar as to how you want your recordings to sound. And you want perfection, but the problem is perfection isn't always best. If you take the band's fourth studio album, Suck It and See, for example, that whole album was largely recorded live, with all four members in a room working out and recording parts together. And so the album contains all of those small imperfections that a live band would have when they play live. But what it also captures is the magic that you get when you have all four members of the band in one rehearsal room playing and feeding off each other's energy. And for me, the car just lacks that feel altogether, and to be honest, I do miss it. And it's really noticeable that it's not there. In fact, it doesn't really sound like a band at all. That familiarity, especially me as a musician, being able to pick out Alex's part, pick out Jamie's part, for example, from the recordings, just isn't there anymore. I mean, the band all do live across the world in different locations now, so the likelihood of them getting together in a rehearsal room every day for 6 months is pretty unlikely, to be honest. But the end product is always going to be different when you're doing that versus sending Pro Tools sessions to each other across the internet, trying to build something up over the course of weeks. And that leads me to my next point around the actual songs turning out different also. One of the key criticisms I have on some but not all of the songs on this album is Alex's meandering style vocals. And the way that the album was made this time around kind of explains or gives an explanation to why that could be. I mean, it sounds like the band spent and took a lot of time creating this lush, really deep and rich backing track, and then Alex basically just tried to sing stuff and jigsaw stuff onto the top of the instrumentation. In other words, it kind of sounds like the vocal melodies and the lyrics weren't written in harmony with the instrumentation, pardon the pun. And the result is, well, just meandering, uninteresting vocals in some of these songs. I mean, if you take Sculptures of Anything Goes, or even the title track of the album, The Car, both of these songs sound kind of meandering to me, and there's no real vocal hook, nothing that really draws you in, and it just sounds a bit cobbled together to me. But maybe I'm being a little bit harsh here, because on a lot of these songs that approach does actually work really well. Mirrorball is a standout one for me. I just think the way that the vocal melodies flow in that song is just beautiful. So, in conclusion, I guess those are my thoughts on Arctic Monkeys' new album, The Car. But I'm just still so confused for a few reasons, really. The first is just the stark difference between the feel and the sound of the songs live versus a recorded version. I just feel as though if there was a live version of the album from start to finish, I'd probably rate it very highly, and it's likely that it would be sat there looking pretty amongst AM and Arctic Monkeys' best ever work. But the recorded version, despite it sounding pretty perfect and pristine, is just missing something for me. It just doesn't get me there in the same way that a lot of the other Arctic Monkeys albums do. But oddly, when I listen to the live versions, they do. So it's a little bit confusing for me, not quite sure what to make of that yet, but let me know in the comments if you feel the same way. Do you think that the way in which the album's been made just means it's missing something, missing a bit of soul or a bit of heart that you really feel when you hear the live versions? The second thing that makes me a little bit confused about this album is actually the sonic direction. The album is just so varied, which naturally makes me a bit confused about the band's future and in terms of where they're headed next with their sound. I guess given that the band are working in this new way and are often separated geographically, will they ever return to that rock band sound that we loved about them in the first place? Is this just a sonic detour, or is it in fact where the band are headed for the foreseeable future? I mean, if you think about it, it's been almost a decade since the band have released an album that sounds like a rock band. Just let that sink in. A decade. Do you think they'll ever return to that classic rock band sound, given that this is the case? Let me know in the comments. These are all questions that I'm going to attempt to answer over the coming weeks. But yeah, overall I'd say I really do like the album. It's been very carefully and tastefully crafted, and it really is a work of art, to be honest. But the recorded version of the album in particular does miss in some crucial areas for me. But I'm really interested to know what the consensus is. Like, do you guys agree with me on these points or disagree? Let me know why in the comments. And with that, if you did enjoy the video, do smash the like button. And if you are looking for more Arctic Monkeys content to watch, there should be some more videos appearing on screen right about now. See you in the next one.